I'm thinking of a world in which my goddaughters don't make 80 cents on the dollar,
Yeah,
still don't have to worry about being sexually harassed on the job,
yeah,
don't have to worry about which state they live in order to access reproductive health,
yeah,
or as we are being, threatened with now, the idea that the federal government would have any record of their gestational progress.
yeah,
That is a world in which a female president is not a novelty and
yeah,
hasn't happened yet. Many of these things, like as I was writing this book, I was thinking of them and,
yeah.
how far women have absolutely come, but also how far we really have to go. And
Have to
this
go.
is a
Yeah.
little bit of like, I hope, a stepping stone upward to the better place.
So the book came out, what, at the beginning of July?
July 2nd, yes.
So I saw, I think today or yesterday, I was reading a review in The Guardian, which was good. And I'm
Mhm.
just wondering who's reviewed it and who hasn't at this point.
Well, WAPO reviewed it.
Yeah.
Um, it's made some best of lists for summer reading. And then the Times reviewed it, and predictably they savaged it. And I'm happy to talk about that review if you would like.
I didn't look at that. I just wondered when that came out.
That came out, I think, like the day before the book was published.
Yeah.
And I knew that it was getting eyeballs because they kept that review up on their homepage for like 48 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, I figured they wouldn't like it given how they've treated other stuff on the Kennedys.
Well, as even in reading the book, like the Times has a lot to answer for in the way they've treated these
Yeah,
women.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, so let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And today my guest is Maureen Callahan. And Maureen is an award-winning investigative journalist, author, columnist, and commentator whose work has appeared everywhere, including Vanity Fair, New York Spin, and the New York Post, where she is a critic at large. She's the author of a book I just finished reading this morning. And as I said to Maureen moments ago, I'm sorry I read it in Kindle because I can't hold up a dog-eared copy of a book that's terrific, and that is Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. Housekeeping, please subscribe to this podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentaries. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So, Maureen, having just finished the book, we were chit-chatting a moment ago, and that's a good place to start, on why the New York Times savaged this book. And parenthetically, The Guardian, which is a left-wing newspaper par excellence, as you know, did not savage it. They wrote a good review of it, truthful. It reflects the book. I just read the book when I read it this morning. Why in particular does the New York Times go to bat for the Kennedy clan, and how long is that history? Does it goes all the way back to Joseph Kennedy and his Nazi sympathies? Did it start with President Kennedy? I know that this is no way to get into the book, which we'll talk about in a minute, but before we do, what is it with the New York Times and the Kennedy clan that they keep going to bat for them and whitewashing anything that might tell the truth about the predilection of the male Kennedys to go from being rapists to molesters to brutes to women with a track record of having basically damaged and or destroyed every woman they take up with? Why in 2024, after Me Too, and in the context, by the way, of going after Donald Trump, justifiably, I think, for the fact that he's been known as a rapist and certainly a molester, grabbing people's quote unquote pussy that he brags about. In that context, you'd think now the New York Times and other liberal media who have shilled for the Kennedys would come clean on the male domestic abusers, which the Kennedys are, and which your book basically irrefutably documents. So first, let's start. What's the problem with the New York Times?
Oh, Frank, first of all, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Secondly, that's a huge diagnostic that is above my pay grade. But let's talk about the New York Times and the Kennedys. So, they have a lot to answer for in the way that they have written about women and girls who have come into that orbit
Right.
and found themselves maimed, raped, left for dead, what have you. And it's sort of a larger problem in the culture. But in the book, I talk about there are two cases in particular. And
Mm.
for your listeners, they should know the book is written like a novel, right?
Yeah.
So the reader will always be in the heads and the hearts of these women as they go through these extraordinary life circumstances and events.
Yeah.
One of these young girls was named Pam Kelly. She was a teenager when she was left paralyzed after Joseph Kennedy III recklessly drove his Jeep through Nantucket, flipped it. Kids went flying everywhere. Pam was left paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
The New York Times called this Joe's quote unquote mishap. In their coverage of his trial, such as it was a sham trial. He was let off with $100 fine and an encouragement from the judge, a family friend, to do something good with his last name. Pam's name wasn't mentioned until the very last paragraph.
Yeah.
In the back of the book, I talk about a woman named Pamela Bowman, who credibly accused William Kennedy Smith of raping her in Palm
Yeah.
Beach in the early 90s. The New York Times outed this woman by name. And not only that, they shredded her reputation in the public square.
Yeah.
They cast aspersions on her for being a single mother, for being out on a Friday night, for being dressed as they editorialized for male attention.
Yeah.
So they have a lot to answer for, and none of that was really brought to bear in the Times review, which I take clearly as a badge of honor.
I would have imagined the Times being, the gray lady, the liberal bastion of fair opinion and so forth, that any reviewer would have started by honestly admitting that in your book, you go after the newspaper he or she is reviewing the book for. Because, it would seem to me that the first thing one would do as a reviewer for a newspaper that has been named as having failed at its journalistic task of accurately covering the Kennedys all the way into the Kennedy White House, where the president was, doing all sorts of things to young women who were in and around with him, by comparison of which, we look at this quote unquote scandal around Bill Clinton, which was as nothing compared to what was going on with the Kennedys. Has there ever been a piece in the New York Times or in the major media that goes back and says, we got this wrong? In the way, for instance, about 20 years ago, there was a piece that the Times wrote, someone in the Times wrote, where they finally admitted that they had gotten Joseph Stalin wrong and had covered up for the famine. They went back and said, hey, we were of the left, we made a mistake. There was some idea that they kind of came to grips with that. Is there anything like that in the Times or the Washington Post or the other newspapers that have gone out of their way to cover for the males in the Kennedy clan, either by omission or by tearing down and lying about women to cover up what they've done to them?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, Frank. I can't say with 100% certainty, but with JFK, for example, whose scandals were constantly minimized as well. He sort of catted around. He was a philanderer. One of the girls in the book is Mimi Alford, who was 19 when she started at the White House.
Yeah.
On her very first day, she was invited up to the private residence, gotten drunk. The president throws her on a bed, and within 3 minutes has taken her virginity.
Yeah.
And to this day, she doesn't know if she can classify that as a rape, as an assault, but she does write that short of screaming, she could not get him off of her.
Yeah.
And 3 days later, the president orders Mimi to orally service one of his aides while he watches. So we're beyond, sort of is womanizing a characterological problem with a president.
Yeah.
And I do believe that the constant cover up, especially on the more liberal media, you can draw a direct through line from JFK's White House to Bill Clinton's White House.
Exactly.
Let's not forget that JFK was Bill's great idol. Let's not forget that when Bill's own quote unquote bimbo eruptions happened, one of which, by the way, includes an incredibly credible accusation of rape by Juanita Broderick. But the White House marshaled Hillary Clinton among these task force members, I call them,
Yeah.
to put in effect what they called a quote unquote nuts and sluts campaign.
Yeah.
So that means that any woman or girl who was going to come forward and accuse Bill Clinton of sexual impropriety was going to be either a nut or a slut. That is
Yeah.
Kennedy Playbook 101.
Yeah.
And that is still, even though we're post Me Too, very much with us, and why this book is extremely relevant.
Well, and speaking of relevance, most topically right now, John F. Kennedy's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is currently running as an independent candidate for the presidency with, ironically, a female running mate.
Not ironically, that's absolutely a deliberate ploy.
Yeah, and what I don't understand is why that has not become, a story item in terms of just talking about him. I mean, the worm in the brain and all that is very interesting, and his anti-vax insanity and conspiratorial stuff, third-party nonsense, all this bullshit. But the real fact about him is that he is part of a clan that has such a 100% history of abuse of women that you would think that that would be the first thing that anybody would talk about, and maybe the only thing that would really make a big difference. And again, your book could not be more timely, because this guy's actually trying to run for president and could damage either the Republican or the Democratic candidacy of whomever. Irrespective of that, why has not his abuse of women, because he's in your book too, been a story?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the deal with that?
I mean, I think this is where you see the complete lopsidedness and hypocrisy of much of the mainstream corporate media.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, rightly, is held to account for terrible things he says. And I talk about this in the intro to the book. Grab him by the pee, horrifies. It should. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over here gaslit, psychologically, emotionally, financially tormented his wife, Mary Richardson, mother of 4 of his children, who committed suicide, whose remains he fought for, then secretly had dug up in the middle of the night so that she would be buried far away and alone on the side of a hill, who continues to drag her name through the mud, saying that any associations he has ever had with Jeffrey Epstein were her fault, not true. And he remains remarkably unbothered by questions regarding his treatment of his wife and what he really thinks about women.
Yeah.
And I think this is outrageous. And I think
it is outrageous.
No matter what side of the aisle you are on, should be demanding that Bobby Kennedy Jr., if he wants to be president, be held to account for these things.
Yeah, in your book, you somewhere near the opening, you say, and I'm reading from the book, the Kennedys remain a powerful and frequently destructive force, both in our politics and our culture. As of this writing, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., prominent conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer, is running for president, as we mentioned. And then you go on and you say, at another place, history, to paraphrase the adage, is typically told by the victors. But what of the other side? This book tells the stories of women whose lives were upended by Kennedy men, but whose collective history has never been captured in total. In my attempt to do so, I relied on methods common to nonfiction writers and historians, years spent in archival research. So you state at the beginning of the book that you're really actually writing a book of history, albeit in a novelistic narrative way that tells the story so profoundly. And what I want to know is, as you wrote this, how often did you sort of start in your own brain, as I do, whenever the Kennedy name comes up? I don't think of President Kennedy. I think of the grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, and his Nazi sympathies, and the fact that he was Churchill's sworn enemy and made common cause with the Nazi sympathizer who was in the Churchill cabinet at the beginning, tried to cut a separate deal with the Nazis through Mussolini's ambassador to London, and essentially did everything in his power to undo the work of another liberal icon who I happen to admire, and that was President Roosevelt and his effort to defeat the Nazis. Let's just start there for a minute, because in addition to everything else, Grandpa Kennedy not only was a Nazi sympathizer who tried to undo Roosevelt's work and Churchill's work, and we'd be living in a Nazi world now if he had had his way. He
Mhm.
also was a molester slash rapist who has a
Yeah.
story of his own life that should have discredited everybody. In other words, it should have been a stench to the high heavens to be called a Kennedy for 200 years after he was on this earth. Let's talk about him for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I begin with him in the intro. I talk about Joe Kennedy Sr.'s two original sins, two
Yeah,
biblical original sins. The first, as you pointed out, Frank, was political. The bloodless acceptance of the death of democracy in the West, the
yeah,
Nazi sympathies, which his eldest son, Joe Jr., also shared. Joe, who he
yes,
was grooming
yes,
to be the first president, who died during the war. And then you have his personal original sin, which was the forced secret lobotomy of his young, beautiful, vivacious daughter, Rosemary,
yeah,
who was then hidden away for the rest of her life.
yeah,
Now, Rosemary, when her existence became known in the American popular media, that would be around sometime in the 1980s with the
yeah,
real birth of tabloid mass media. The Kennedy machine explained this away thusly. Rosemary suffered from learning disabilities. She had emotional disorders. The Kennedys were busy raising future presidents. They were trying to overcorrect for her intellectual shortcomings. They had her undergo this experimental surgery. It was a failure. And God, what a shame and how awful they felt about that.
right,
Not so, as with everything the Kennedys put forth, you really have to take a jaundiced eye to it.
yeah,
What came out in my reporting, and there's a lot of original reporting in this book as well. It's not just sort of as others who might try to minimize the stories of these women say rehashed gossip. It's not.
yeah,
But what really came to light was that there were close Kennedy family friends who long suspected that there was something very sinister in the way that Joe related to Rosemary.
yeah,
He kept her apart from the other siblings. He left her in London alone during the war,
yeah.
which he thought Hitler would win. Hitler, who was going to exterminate anyone of intellectual diminished capacity,
Which he already was doing in Germany.
which he already was doing in Germany. So, right there, you have to ask, death wish? Does Joe have a death wish for his daughter because she's
Yeah,
such a. And as Rosemary continued to become more difficult to control, her
mm,
outbursts were becoming more marked and pronounced. The fear was that she was going to articulate what Joe had been doing to her.
yeah,
He
yeah,
had been molesting her, and she had to be shut up. Frankly, I think what was done to Rosemary is a fate worse than death.
yeah,
Killing her would have been more compassionate. And I realize what an extreme thing that is to say, but
yeah,
that is the extremes in which the Kennedys operate.
yeah,
Nothing is off the table.
yeah. And the thing is, too, the networks of friends they have in the sort of power structure, the word elite is thrown around too loosely about so many things these days. But in this case, there is a kind of a cabal of people who have surrounded the Kennedys, that kind of looks like the Jeffrey Epstein cover up years later, or even the Bill Clinton cover ups that followed. It looked like Sunday school picnics compared to the long history of the Kennedy family, up into including people who have credibly claimed that Joseph Kennedy, in addition to everything else, with his connections with the U.S. mob, which have been documented,
Mhm.
played some part in, not to put it too delicately, stealing the election in 1960 for
Oh,
his
yeah,
son.
buying the election for JFK. Yes,
Yeah,
batmen were often seen at multiple Democratic precincts. This is historical fact.
yeah, yeah. And by the way, parenthetically, a fact that comes out very nicely as an aside in the Scorsese long picture, The Irishman,
Familiar with it?
in
Yeah.
which you can't understand what happened to some of these mob murderers unless you understand the Kennedy connection into the election. Anyway,
Yes,
um,
I remember watching that and that blowing my mind. I thought,
yeah,
oh, Scorsese is talking about this. Okay. Like this now is going to an American audience is going to give this more credibility because Martin Scorsese is
sure.
acknowledging it.
So let me go to a big subject, and let me say again, I just want to tell everybody, you absolutely have to read this book. It's stomach churning. If you happen to be in love with a woman as I am with Jeannie, we've been together 54 years, or my daughters and granddaughters, you'll feel sick because this hits home. Anybody who's halfway decent will have trouble reading some of these things. On the other hand, it's one of the great injustices, which is continuing, that Maureen has kind of bravely stood up on, which is this ridiculous hero worship of the Kennedy clan not only do they have feet of clay, it's far worse than that. And her book is only, what, 40, 50, 60 years overdue. Um,
But had it come out 40, 50, 60 years ago, it would have been ignored. It would have been, minimized as just partisan belly aching. I'll
yeah,
tell you, Frank, I realized that this book came into laser focus for me
yeah,
after Harvey Weinstein was convicted in a New York City criminal court of
yeah,
rape.
yeah,
And that conviction was so bracing because it was a verdict delivered by a jury pool that was composed of more men than women,
yeah,
that had witnesses whose stories were very complicated, who had kept in touch with Harvey Weinstein after they allege these rapes had taken place.
yeah,
And I thought, now the culture is ready for this. We have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what rape is,
yeah,
of what power differentials are, of what a victim looks and sounds and
yeah,
behaves like. And
yeah,
it's not always like a virtuous through line that you can definitively say, bad man, good woman. Do you
yeah.
know?
Hey, let me just add something here for people who are listening who know me. I come out of a very strict religious background of evangelical activists in the 70s and the 80s. Our family had a lot to do with the fact that Roe got reversed by what I'll call the Trump Republican court. I'm very much on the other side now. But let me tell you something, just for the record, everybody who's listening to this. There's one thing that I don't do, and that is I will not brush over and pretend it doesn't matter if someone or a family or an individual is doing something on, quote, my side of the politics. I have one rule that I try never to break, and one question I ask about religions, cultures, leaders, countries, societies, bits of history. My first question is always, okay, fine, but how did they treat women? And it seems to me that if you fail that test, that all the rest is just shit. It doesn't matter what you say about race or economics or policy or taxes or government programs. If the question, but how did he, how did they, how did this culture, how does this religion treat women? If the answer is not well, then the hell with you. And I feel very much about the Kennedy clan and the males in it that Maureen has written about in her book, Ask Not. So I just want to say also a thing that Maureen says in her book is this. This is not an ideological or partisan book, she says. It's about 13 women and a piece of American history hiding in plain sight. Kennedy men have been valorized and lionized for nearly a century, but the women they've broken, tormented, raped, murdered, or left for dead have never really been part of their legacy. And as we've said earlier in this program, shame on the main quote unquote mainstream media for ducking this just because they refuse to apply the same level of scrutiny to these people as they did, say, to a Harvey Weinstein or others. And I just want to say another thing, and even Harvey would have gotten away with everything. And so would Jeffrey Epstein. And if you look at his case, you see a collaboration between Republican leaders like Starr and Democratic leaders like Clinton and his cabal of people in doing something to exonerate, hush up, cover, minimize. Why? Because he had the names of them and the Kennedys and luminaries on the right and left in his dirty little book of people that he was sharing young women with. And all I can say as a 72-year-old man who's firmly on the side of progressive politics, this is poison to our point of view. If we put up with this shit, then what are we talking about rights and dignity for to begin with? So I love the fact you brought your book out, and I want to congratulate you on your courage for doing it. This is a really important book.
Thank
And
you.
not least of which, you're speaking for the unheard.
Yeah.
And, these women have not been given a hearing. So thank you for trying to do some justice here. Anyway, I know that I made too long a speech. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I just want to circle back to one thing you said vis-a-vis Epstein and Kennedy's. I don't know of any direct accusation that Kennedy men were
Sure,
taking advantage of the women and girls that
sure.
Jeffrey Epstein was keeping.
And I
Um,
wasn't implying that. I'm just talking about the whole milieu in which we live, where people can get away with anything as long as women are demonized. Oh, she's just a teenager. She's a drug addict. She's a drunk. Her skirt was too short. I'm
yeah.
talking about that whole approach.
Yes, and women themselves can often be the worst offenders when this stuff is coming to light. And I
Sure.
would point to Mimi Alford, the teenage intern I was just speaking with you about, who JFK got drunk, sexually assaulted. In my opinion, I think it's very clear. When her memoir came out, it was ignored
Yeah.
by the mainstream media, completely ignored. I
Yeah.
remember I was at the New York Post at the time. I'm at the Daily Mail now. But back then, we found that book. I remember a colleague of mine, a very good friend, found that book. We made it a front page story.
Yeah.
That book, like, broke the membrane of, oh, JFK was just a troubled guy, but like a great leader.
Yeah.
She began making the rounds, and I'll never forget seeing her being pilloried by Barbara Walters on The
Yeah.
View,
Yeah.
who said to her, and I quote, "Why can't you just let this go?"
Yeah. To which I would say, my producer, Ernie Gregg, just sent me this note. We, that's me and Ernie and our podcast In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, get dinged for criticizing the left sometimes. But he added this, but if you can't take the predators in your own party to account, you might be in a cult yourself.
Of course. And listen, I think everybody would do well to view anyone who wants that
Agreed.
amount of power.
Yeah.
I don't care what your ideology is, what your political stripe is. I think you should view them with deep suspicion.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Hey, by the way, just parenthetically, and I'll reintroduce you in a second, but I would like to make your book part of our It Has to Be Read book club. I
Oh,
think
I
it's
would
very
love that.
important. And we do that, and then we would have you back and maybe on a panel, whatever. But it's another way of promoting your book because it's
I would
really
love that.
important. And I refuse to be one of these lefty liberals who sees no evil on our side of the fence. I think that we do ourselves tremendous long-term damage. The
I
hypocrisy
couldn't agree with you more.
is awful. And if you want people to vote for, you know, uh, good candidates, you've got to tell the truth. So if we might do that, that would be good. And Ernie will
I
tell
would
me
love
what
that.
month we can, he'll message me and say what month it is. The book is Ask Not. And I'm just going to go back and say this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest is Maureen Callahan. And Maureen is an award-winning investigative journalist. She's written a book called Ask Not. Um, and the subtitle is The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And destroyed is not an overstatement. Everybody knows what Maureen is saying is true out there. Nobody wants to go there on the left because, oh, these are our guys. Let's just forget it. Let's get back to talking about grab her by the pussy, Trumpian stuff because we're comfortable with that. But let's not talk about the Kennedys raping women or killing them or disappearing them or ignoring them or shaming them or their collaborators in the media going along with this shit.
And
So
Frank,
you,
can I just
yeah,
say one thing here regarding this and what makes this again a sadly all too relevant book? When you
yeah,
talk about the left covering for their side while, going after Trump for his misogyny,
yeah,
let's talk about Joe Biden.
yeah.
Let's talk about his daughter, his adult daughter, who filed court documents a couple of months ago in which she acknowledged that her stolen diary, her found diary, was
Hmm,
legitimate. It was hers, it was authentic. And in that diary, she is working out while she is in rehab for sex addiction and substance abuse addiction, the root causes of her problems. And
hmm,
in that diary, she writes, "Was I molested? I think so.
hmm, hmm,
Showers with my dad,
hmm.
probably not appropriate." Tell me, did you see any coverage of this in the New York Times
Hey,
on
none
any media?
whatsoever. The thing is, once again, and I don't know enough about that to comment on it, and I am a Biden fan or was until he dropped out and will work very hard uh, to get the first woman president elected. But that said, you bring up a good point, and that is, again, I'm very tired of this partisanship when it comes to everything else. I'm willing to go a little ways in that direction. Somebody had a DUI when they were 18. Okay, that's too bad. uh, somebody made a mistake in filing taxes and so forth. But there's one area that I won't go into, and that is compromising the same standard we hold other males or religions or people to when it comes to the treatment of women. And so again, my rule is really simple. After everything's said and done, how do they treat women? What is their relationship with women? How does a country treat women? How do people treat women? And here's something that we need to admit. The left and the liberal, enlightened, woke community is no better at this than the far right. We're all part of the same sick, misogynist culture when it comes to how women have been treated. And I'm through with it, and we'll call out people. I don't care what their politics are, or what it does to any election cycle.
Mhm.
Um, that don't tell the truth about this, and I love the fact that you have told the truth about it.
Yeah, and because I agree completely how any sort of underprotected class is treated by people in power. You know, I feel as though in this election cycle
Yeah,
right now, what the Dems have, which is their superpower, but really their only strong argument, is reproductive rights.
yeah,
But you cannot also say that you don't know what a woman is. Do you know? You
yeah,
can't also say that girls should be forced to compete with biological boys. You can't throw red meat at your base and say Trump is going to destroy American democracy, and then have a reporter as prominent and respected as Ezra Klein at the New York Times say, as he
yeah,
did a week ago, that he speaks regularly to top Dems who have said, if another Trump term happens, I can work with that guy.
yeah,
Democracy's going to die.
yeah,
And what this all does is it takes the electorate for fools. And
yeah,
you can do a lot to people to try to manipulate them, but the minute they think that you think they're stupid, you're done.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's very, very apropos of American politics in general. And
Hmm.
it would be such a relief to have political candidates come clean about their own party. And
Hmm.
instead of always pointing the finger across the aisle, say, hey, we
Hmm.
have a problem here, um, and not play this partisan game the whole time. And like I say, I will play the partisanship game. I do. But there are some areas I won't go. I won't play it
Hmm.
with anti Semitism. I won't play
Hmm.
it with what happens to women. I
Hmm.
won't play it with race. I
Hmm.
won't play it with what happens to children. For me, it's like, like those old style mobster movies where the hitman will do anything but won't kill a child. There's a sort of a
Gold
limit.
star, gold star. Yeah,
Go,
I
yeah, there's a
know.
limit. And to me, my I mean, in a funny, weird way, this ties in emotionally for me with the fact that I have a son, John, who volunteered for the Marine Corps in 1999 as a lark, and then, of course, a few months later, after 9/11, found
Yeah.
himself in Afghanistan fighting tooth and nail back in the early part of that war. And that kind of sobered me up in terms of, well, what are we fighting for?
Yeah.
And I remember him sending me a picture, and I know this is divergent. I had no intention of telling you this, and I've forgotten we're in a podcast now. I'm just talking with you over a cup of coffee. But I remember I don't have many pictures that he'd sent from combat because what he was doing was classified for one thing. But he had a picture that somebody took of him on one of the downtimes from Bagram Air Force Base, where he was located in Signals Intel, and he went on missions from there. He didn't send it to me to make himself look good, but he and another Marine would take time off to guard a girls' school because the Taliban kept attacking them. And the Islamist forces they were fighting would target these girls. And so my son sent a picture standing with an M16 in out of uniform, by the way, because it wasn't official. And it was him and a teacher who I'm guessing is dead now, who was a male teacher who's probably been killed by the Taliban. And he was surrounded by these beautiful little children, um, who I'm guessing were ages 5 through 13 or 14, maybe 30 or 40 little girls. And he said, we're taking turns guarding this girls' school near the base because otherwise they'll all be killed. And I thought, okay, I don't know how this war will go. And I happen to know the Bush family personally from the days when I was in the religious right. And I don't even, I do not like Bush. And I thought, of course, when he went into Iraq, it was a mistake. And my son wound up there too. But I don't care. I so admired what my son was doing in guarding those little girls so they could have a shot at an education. And of course, my heart's broken since then. That they haven't been able to continue that. But I thought to myself, okay, I don't know what this war's about or how we'll succeed, but I know what my son is and I know why he's there, and I'm proud of him and I'm proud of my country. And it's because of that stand on the right of a young female to be educated, just that. It really stuck in my mind. And I've got the picture on my staircase, and I look at it every day when I come down from my bedroom. Kind of one of those touchstones. Okay, I know what this was, whatever else shit is happening. When you extrapolate that to your book and you realize the dishonor, if I may use that word, in the context of having been talking about the Marines, of a country that has a political system and a media system that covers up for people that rape children and girls, forced marriages, genital mutilation, whatever it may be, and whatever culture that is, and to think that it's in one of our leading political families right here is just absolutely sickening. And so, you've written a book that needed to be read. Written.
Well, first of all, Frank, thanks to your son for his service,
Yeah.
for what he did off duty, off book, in protecting young girls who were just seeking the ability to read a book and learn something.
Yeah.
And I think your point is well taken. If you flash forward or flash backward even, when you look at the muscularity with which the Kennedys destroyed women, we're not even talking about just sort of teenage girls with little to no access to power.
Sure.
We're talking about extremely famous women.
Yeah.
We're talking about women with their own power and money. We're talking about Jackie Kennedy. We're talking about Marilyn Monroe. We're talking about the machine that turned Chappaquiddick, which it's regrettably called now, but which was the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, a 29-year-old Kennedy campaign aide who a lot of Americans don't even know her name. He left her to die alone, a slow, agonizing death in like 3 feet of water. This craven criminal act was spun successfully by the Kennedy machine and their enablers in the media as Ted's tragedy. This was the thing that would keep Ted from ever becoming president, while they simultaneously were castigating and humiliating Ted's beautiful wife, Joan, mother of his 3 children, as a drunk who just kept dragging poor Ted down. In the book, readers will come across a vignette that is horrifying that took place in the 80s that was reported in GQ, where Ted, out to lunch with a fellow prominent U.S. senator, sexually assaults a waitress on the floor of a restaurant in the dining room. And nothing happened to him. This is a very real with us history that unless we reckon with it and flush it out and say we will never tolerate this again, will only perpetuate.
Yeah, and it's apropos of which, as someone who's 72 and lived in the 60s and met my wife because she hadn't listened to Abbey Road yet, and I had it downstairs in my studio. I'm from that era. And I can remember, our rock gods gradually, again, the media was hesitant to do this, but gradually would be outed for the schoolgirls that they would rape in their hotel suites. This is an ugly era. And, we'll parse Robert Plant singing "Squeeze My Lemon Till the Juice Runs Down My Leg" and what was happening in hotel rooms, all over the world with rock stars and little girls. We won't go to the Kennedys, though, because it ties in with today's politics. It ties in with Clinton. It ties in with the entire edifice and machinery of the Democratic left, of which I am a part, by the way.
Well,
but we don't go there.
Obama needed the Kennedy family nod. He needed their, blessing.
To kiss the ring
before he was going to catapult over Hillary in 2008. So the idea that they don't remain a power center is completely false. And I do think that, I was watching this. I don't know if you recall, it was covered on major American network television, the unveiling of a life-size statue of JFK.
I remember what you're talking about.
2021.
And it's in your book.
Yes, I talk about it in the very beginning.
Yeah,
And I remember watching this. I was writing the book at the time and thinking if this book were out, I would hope that we would be having a much more heated debate about whether this man is
yeah, whether it should
deserving
be
of
there.
memorials such as this, given what we know now
Sure.
about what he did to women and
Yeah.
girls.
Yeah. I have a question for you. I want to change gears here a little bit. I'm in
Mhm.
conversation with Maureen Callahan, and we're talking about her book. And it's called Ask Not, the Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. Let's shift gears here and just thumbnail sketch me in no particular order or in the order you mention them in your book, the individual stories you tell and attach to which Kennedy male names. Let's go through the list so people understand we're not talking about one or two things here. It's pervasive, it's a whole family, it's their entire history. Again, let's start with Joseph Kennedy, the Nazi sympathizer, and then bring it all the way up to the present day with the current Kennedy who's running for president again.
Okay, so we have Joe, the Nazi sympathizer, who lobotomizes his daughter and shunts her off to live her days being cared for by nurses on the other side of the country. And her own siblings don't know where she is, what has happened to her, if she is even still alive.
And we're maybe shutting her up because she's been raped by her father.
Yes, and as JFK would say of his father, whenever his sisters had friends stay over at the compound, JFK would say, "You'd better lock your doors. The
Yeah,
ambassador has a tendency to wander at night," which meant he will break into your room and rape you.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Then we have JFK, who, in turn, notwithstanding, there's another teenage girl in the book. His wife, Jackie, he's a senator seeking to become president, gives birth to a stillborn daughter.
Yeah,
He is off partying in the Mediterranean with other women. He gets the call and he says, "What does it matter? The baby is dead. I'm not coming home." Jackie is left alone in a hospital bed for eight
hmm,
days to mourn a daughter she never got to hold or to bury. This is the first time Jackie almost divorces him.
yeah,
Also, is sent by JFK packing off to a mental facility to undergo electroshock therapy three
hmm,
times in 1 week. So violent, she thought her bones were going to break because Jackie had the temerity to express her deep upset that her husband was cheating.
yeah,
Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., JFK's attorney general, the two of them used, abused, tossed aside, and contributed to the suicide of Marilyn Monroe.
yeah,
Ted, we have Chappaquiddick, Joan, many other instances. JFK Jr. to me is one of the most interesting because, as I'm sure you know, Frank, last week we just went through the 25th anniversary of the
yeah,
plane crash
yeah,
that killed JFK Jr., his wife Carolyn, her sister Lauren Bissett. And every anniversary, it's the hand wringing over what we lost. What a great guy. It is not so. This is a guy, as you will see laid out very carefully throughout the book, had a lifelong death wish and
yeah,
wasn't just coming up to almost killing himself multiple times, but bullying the girlfriends in his life to also risk their lives with him,
yeah,
leveraging his inordinate fame. There was nobody as big as JFK Jr.
yeah,
Um, what is laid out in the book is what happened that night, which has continually been blamed on Carolyn,
yeah,
who had the misfortune just to be on that plane along with her sister.
yeah,
JFK Jr. broke every single rule of aviation that night, every single one. Underreported, if unreported by the mainstream media. He almost crashed into a packed American Airlines commercial flight making its descent to JFK.
yeah.
This guy was on a murder suicide mission. I don't know whether he was
Redefines
conscious
the
of
word
it.
recklessness. Recklessness.
It's beyond recklessness. It's
Yeah,
it's it's a and it's fine if you want to take yourself out, take yourself out. Leave other people out of it. There was something very dark in his psyche, and it was allowed to not just fester but flourish because all JFK got back from the culture and the mainstream media was how wonderful he was.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is, right now, what I don't understand is, again, as I said earlier, why the current Kennedy running for office is getting a pass on this again. A lot is being talked about, but the Kennedy male history of abuse, is really the only story there. I'm talking about the book Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Woman They Destroyed with Maureen Callahan. Please subscribe to this podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary series. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.com, at substack.com. And we are going to put this book in as a book club offering. And Ernie, maybe you can text me a good date so we know what month that might be. And it's August, so soon. A month after your book comes out, it'll be on our book club, and people can get that through us, and we will push this podcast with you further and maybe have you back as part of a panel. I'd like to actually invite you back with some of our very interesting women authors who are writing from a position of a more left-wing position, not so much on the news, but their own story. Because again, one of the things I try to do within Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, much to the horror of some of my liberal listeners, is, excuse me, I should say this in a little bit, I talk to people I don't agree with, and I'm polite.
How novel. How
Yeah,
novel.
how interesting.
How interesting. Doesn't that make
Yeah,
for interesting conversation? And it's people like you, Frank, who I think are so valuable, because what that implies, and I'm almost always right about this, is you're someone who's open to maybe changing your mind.
you got it. And I have changed my mind in the past about things and might again. But one of the things that I'm sure of, whether it's talking to Melanie Brooks about her book Hard Silence, or a well-trained wife with Tia Levings, who writes about her abuse at the hand of right-wing Christian purity cults and how she was raped on her wedding night. It doesn't matter who the woman is when she tells her story, or you tell their stories for them because they've been silenced. You've got my attention. Because one thing I know as a male who's knocked around for 72 years and went to boys' British boarding schools and so forth and so on, is that there are plenty of men out there who will do to women anything they think they can get away with. The difference between them and the Kennedys is the Kennedys have the money and connection to get away with it. And they've been getting away with it. And it's about time somebody told the story, which you do. So we're going to make that our August book club offering. So let me ask you, let me ask you about how you see the future. The Me Too movement, Jeffrey Epstein, all this stuff. Here we go with your book. One thing that liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans seem to agree on is to wink and nod when somebody on their own side, be that Trump or a Kennedy, pulls the same shit when it comes to women, and we pretend it won't happen, or we call it fake news. And both groups do that. I'm not speaking of moral equivalency here, but they've both done this as the past the Kennedys have been given shows. Are things going to get better, Maureen? I mean, you got your ear to the ground. You're a journalist. Is there more? Let me put it this way. If you were starting a Kennedy clan now, could you get away with this shit if this was all brand new? Can someone new show up and do this?
Well, definitely not. And just number one, technology, the internet. We all have iPhones. There would be much more documentation, visual, audio that we would have to prove these things. But I think, I've been really gratified by the reception the book has gotten in terms of the way it's selling. That says to me that this book has struck a real nerve. And I think that we get better when women realize that this line we've been sold, and the Kennedys were real masters at this, as were the Clintons. Doesn't really matter how they treat women in their personal life. That's their business. What matters is how they legislate for you. Do they legislate well for you? Focus on that. Don't be a small-minded woman whose intellect is so limited that you focus on salacious stuff over here. Not so. This is all of a piece. And beware of any man who does not respect women, does not treat them as equals, or believe they are equals, or maybe even in some cases superior.
Yeah, in my case, definitely so. I went to the bank this morning to try to deposit a check while my wife Jeannie's in California with her sisters, and I had to bring the checkbook and show it to the cashier and say, my wife does all our finances, as you know, because they know her. We've lived in the same place for a long time. I don't know anything about all this. Could you please show me how to deposit a check, because I don't know how to do it. It's been 30 years since I've done anything financial because I'm such a screw up at this. And of course, Jeannie's very good at it, as you know, and she laughed because they all know my wife. And that's the way smart men roll. That's why I have a woman doctor, and that's why I have a woman lawyer, and that's why my agent is a woman, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Smart men understand that, the feminist point of view is the greatest gift to males who will get with the program of anything out there. Uh, in that context, I would urge men of whatever age to be interested in this book and spread the word, because we can't claim to be on the side of the women in our lives unless we are on the side of the women who are unheard. And I think the biggest thing to me, Maureen, about your book, if I could single out one thing, is that the women you write about, even Jackie Kennedy, who's a public
Mhm.
figure, have not been heard. They have
No.
been shut up. And they're still being shut up by newspapers like the New York Times, who either vilify a book like yours, or even women on the left who say, oh, as you were just saying, don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain who happens to be a rapist because he's just legislated in favor of the teachers union and I'm a
Right.
teacher or whatever.
Right.
And that, speaking for myself, I'm one guy, but speaking for myself, I've had it with this. I'm done. And, having done childcare for my 5 grandchildren for the last many years who live nearby, sending my granddaughters out into the world, I want them to go out into a world in which the sensibility of your book is what rules the day, not the cover up that doesn't give women a voice. That's how I feel. Anyway,
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Frank. And I really do think this is a book as much for men, if not more so, as for women.
I think
This
so too.
is this is not just the stories of these women. This is a reconsidered history of the most consequential political family in
Yeah.
American life,
Yeah.
whose tentacles are still poisoning our politics to this day.
Yeah.
And I would encourage any man to, especially if you grew up loving the Kennedys, as my own father did, and
Yeah.
where so much of my inherent fascination came from. The true story is far more complicated and compelling and interesting and provocative than the fake story, than the
Yeah.
Camelot.
Yeah. And it's very easy for males of my political disposition on the left to get up and yell and scream about the mansphere, as it's called, or the manosphere, however we say it, and characters like Andrew Tate. And we can say it's a good thing that he's been arrested, and isn't it awful that young boys are watching his stuff? And I just have a word for anybody out there. If you think Andrew Tate is a problem, he's nothing compared with the story that Maureen is telling, all of which, by the way, is corroborated and very well established in your book with lots of
Thank
sources.
you. Thank you for saying.
I was very impressed with that. So you write in a journalistic, novelistic style, but you're corroborating your information very, very deeply. Let me get to just a sort of not a technicality, but as one writer to another. So when you sent this to your editors, given the power of
Mhm.
the Kennedy clan and their reach, what did people in their legal department say in terms of, Maureen, how do you dare take on this clan? They're gonna come after you. And, do you have enough of a slush fund somewhere to pay the legal bills? You better substantiate everything, because these are mean sons of bitches.
Well, number one, I substantiate everything because that is my job, and I've been
You
doing this
do.
job since I was
Yeah.
17 years old. So, yeah, I do. A book like this, they actually were very excited by a book like this. These are
Yes.
the same publisher that published the Rosemary Kennedy biography that
Yes.
also did incredibly well because it really struck a nerve with people. It was like, oh, this is the truth. This woman was lobotomized forcibly, and what happened to her? And this is
Yeah.
why it matters. So they were 100% behind me. And what they do with a book like this, they know exactly what they've got. They legal it very carefully.
Sure.
We have multiple meetings. I hired my own fact checker, paid for that out of my own pocket, not
Yeah.
cheap. But my job is to get it right. And not
Yeah.
just because I'm writing history, but I owe it to every single person who's going to take their hard earned money and their hard earned free time and read this book and sit with it to know that they are reading the real deal.
Yeah, and I want to go further than that and just say that, we're so much in the business these days of not just identity politics, but the whole story of oppressor and oppressed. whether it's the Palestinian demonstrations in favor of Palestine, whether it's the racial oppress and oppressor, that the white people are always oppressors, or whatever else. There's a lot of that that's really good. And in the spirit of that, I would like to just offer something up. And that is, if we're willing to go after our first president or our the framers of our Constitution because they were slaveholders and out them for their racism and for their idea of equality that happened not to include Black people or women who weren't voting at the time, maybe it's time for someone to read Maureen's book and say, we might want to look at this one again too. And I think the
Frank, I
Kennedys are
love
long
this
overdue.
point. I love this point. And I just want to add something to this because while there are stories that are horrific in this book, you
Yeah.
will also meet women who have incredible strength and fortitude and glamour and charisma and
Mm.
women you would want to know. Jackie Kennedy is one of them. I consider
Yes.
her heroine of this book. Readers will meet three different Jackies. The
Yeah.
last Jackie they'll meet is the liberated single working woman who
Mm.
found a job pursuing her passion, books. She worked as a book editor for major
Yeah.
publishing houses.
Yeah.
One of the books that she is responsible for bringing to the market, and she spent years working with this author, was the biography of Sally Hemings,
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson's slave. And
Sure.
this author, a Black woman, was daunted by this task because if her hunches proved right and DNA testing proved they were,
Yeah.
then a founding father had raped his slave and fathered multiple children with her.
Yeah.
And that was a book Jackie Kennedy thought needed to be out in the world.
Yeah.
So I think Jackie would be behind a book like this.
Well, and
She would
Jackie was
be
doing
behind
that before the
Ascot.
DNA science existed.
Exactly.
And
But
since
that
then,
was,
it's been
yes,
validated. And when that book came out, because I remember when that book came out, it got all sorts of shit from the Jefferson Society or whatever, and they
sure.
denied it. And this couldn't happen. And your book is kind of in the same place. I want to go to something personal here. When I was reading your acknowledgments, I read
Yeah.
acknowledgments. I was very
Yeah.
touched by something, and I want to wax personal for a minute. I love the way
Mhm.
you talked about your goddaughters, and
Yeah.
in the acknowledgments, just said you want to make a better world for young women, and you're thinking of your goddaughters. Just go
Yeah.
there for a second on this personal side, if you don't mind.
I'm thinking of a world in which my goddaughters don't make 80 cents on the dollar,
Yeah,
still don't have to worry about being sexually harassed on the job,
yeah,
don't have to worry about which state they live in order to access reproductive health,
yeah,
or as we are being, threatened with now, the idea that the federal government would have any record of their gestational progress.
yeah,
That is a world in which a female president is not a novelty and
yeah,
hasn't happened yet. Many of these things, like as I was writing this book, I was thinking of them and,
yeah.
how far women have absolutely come, but also how far we really have to go. And
Have to
this
go.
is a
Yeah,
little bit of like, I hope, a stepping stone upward to the better place.
yeah, and here, and well said. And on the battle goes. We hear a lot about Project 2025, but the part that jumped out at me was the association of people at the Heritage Foundation with Opus Dei, which has an agenda that goes back to Franco of Spain, um, that has to do with their long-term aim of not only overturning Roe and choice, but no question about it, they're writing things about saying, well, if we get another Trump presidency, it'll give us the ability to go after contraceptives. And again, whether you're from the left or the right, when you put that together with the milieu in which we live, which is that we cover up for the Kennedys when it comes to how they treat women. Once again, whether you're from the left or the right, why is it that coincidentally, who gets it in the head all the time from both sides? The left covers up for the malfeasance of their heroes who rape girls. The right always has an agenda that somehow, whoa, here we go again. It's all about let's take something away from women. That just seems to me to be more than coincidental. I mean, what is the problem with our country when it comes to how we look at women and their rights?
Well, it's all over. I mean, as you were relating about your son, the most extreme version of the Taliban,
Yeah,
received refusing education and their deeply misogynistic approach to everything. And in America, we still have a ways to go on both sides. And I think this is going to be a very interesting election cycle
Yeah,
now that we have another female running against someone like Trump who's got his issues with women.
yeah,
That is the public perception. And when you say you can grab them by the pee when you're a star, they let you do it. That is something that sticks in people's minds.
yeah,
And when you are, we could go on and on and on. Listen, as I stated at the top, I think when whoever wants that amount of power, whatever side of the aisle, look at them extremely scrupulously. Somebody
yeah,
who thinks they are the ones who should run the world,
yeah.
you owe it to yourself, you owe it to your country. But yes, I really thank you for having me on your show to talk
Yeah, and
about
it's been a real
and
pleasure.
how it relates to women. Because I say it in the back of the book. It's both reconsidered history and sadly a reflection of women circa now. The
Exactly.
fight continues.
Exactly. Okay, so this has been and is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest has been Maureen Callahan. And her book is one that we're going to make an August offering of our book club, and it is called Ask Not, the Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And all I can say is, Maureen, thank you. And it's a great book,
Thank you,
and
Frank.
it's about time. So thanks.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very
Thanks for
much.
having me.
Bye.
Bye.